Hi, everybody. You're through to another installment of Meet the Author, and today we are going to have a chat about Marc Watson's book, Death Dresses Poorly. Marc, would you like to give a little bit about yourself?
I would love to, and thank you very much for having me on today. I am Marc Watson. I am an author from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I have been writing quote unquote professionally since February of 2016. I have had 4 books released, including Death Dresses Poorly. I have also released my Catching Hell science fantasy duology, which is an interesting story in itself as it kind of comes and goes from availability, and it will be re-releasing soon. And then I also have my collection of short stories, which is Between Conversations, Tales from the World of Ryujin, which was released late last year. And that one is the first book that I was able to self-publish. On top of that, I've also had a few short stories published in different anthologies. And when I'm not writing, which is honestly most of the time, I have a full time job that I love. I have a wife and 2 active young boys, and I love coaching them, taking them places, and making them food because I think that a lot of time we just quickly throw food together for kids, and I'm a big fan of making sure that they get a whole bunch of good stuff. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, that's
that,
awesome. Thank you very much for that. Well, just so our listeners and watchers are prepped, towards the end, we're going to do a little bit of a giveaway. And Marc will let us know what books are up for grabs for free and how many potential winners there are going to be. So keep engaged until the end, peeps, to know more. So I was going to start off with the first question of where did your writing journey begin?
my writing journey kind of had 2 distinct starts. The first of which was back when I was about 15 years old. I was in high school at the time. It was the mid 90s, and I could not get this idea for a story out of my head, but I was a very, very, very amateur writer. So I started writing with a pen and paper, and it ended up becoming this weird fantasy trilogy that I was initially just like writing for fun, and then it consumed me, and it almost made me fail grade 11, honestly, because there were times when I'm just like, I'm not listening to what the teacher
Oh,
says.
no.
I'm just going to write. And that kind of told me like, hey, I really enjoy this writing thing. It's something that I should do more often. And then I didn't. And then life happened, and I moved out. I'm originally from Southern Ontario, so I moved out west with a friend of mine, and I met my wife. And yeah, as I said, all these things just kind of happen. Good
Yeah.
things. I'm not saying that they're bad things. And at some point years ago, I found myself in a job that, although the job was great, it wasn't terribly mentally stimulating. So now we're going to fast forward like 20 years from that first kind of writing experience. And I started writing during my lunch hours at work. I would do my work, and then for lunch, I'd take my laptop up to some empty cubicle. I worked in a cubicle farm, I freely admit, and I would just plop myself down and I'd just start writing in that same world. They weren't the same stories, but they're in that same world, and what I call the Ryujin world, also what Catching Hell and Between Conversations is based in.
Hmm.
And so I sat down and I wrote that over the course of about a year. So that was Catching Hell when it was just one story. Eventually it broke into 2. And then I spent about 4 or 5 years in the editing process for that. And I was rereading it and taking things out, and I sat on that for a while. And then by 2016, which is what I mentioned earlier, I had the motivation, the epiphany, the lightning bolt to the brain on February 29th,
Mhm.
2016, the leap day. It's like I should do something with it. I should do something. I am at a point now, like my kids weren't super small anymore. They weren't
Mm.
consuming as much time. And my wife was incredibly encouraging. She's like, no matter what, you wrote a book. You should at least try and get it out there, whether you're successful or not. Like, don't just sit on this.
Mm.
And I'm like, you know what, you're right. So I went back to school part time for writing because I had no formal writing education of any kind. I just liked
Mm.
telling stories. And I signed up for conventions and writers' conferences, and I joined a writing group here in town. All these things that helped me take this hobby more seriously
Mm.
is exactly what I jumped into. And it's been a roller coaster ever since.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I bet along the way in those conventions, you've met a lot of other different genre authors and types of authors as well, haven't you?
Absolutely, there's so many. So I say February. By that following August, we have a convention here in town called When Words Collide. And I knew that this was a thing that was very popular, but I'd never really attended it before. I would have felt a bit like a poser. And I signed up to go to that, and I knew nobody. And
Mm,
I came from a totally different world because by that point I was in my late 30s, and there was a lot of people there like me, but they had been writing for so much longer and had so much more success than me. And then there was also a bunch of like young, fresh faces
mm,
still in college and university, and I didn't find anybody that I really jived with, and a few writers at that particular one really reached out to me. Con Lavery out of Edmonton is one in particular who it was, it was the first interview I had ever given, and
mm.
I had done a reading, and that kind of tied into meeting up with the Imaginative Fiction Writers Association. That's IFWA, based here in
Wow.
town, and there is so many talented people that I get to share a table with
Yeah.
when I get the chance to sit down with them. And it's grown exponentially since then. So my
Wow.
writers circle is considerable now, and I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful for every one of them.
Oh, that sounds amazing. It sounds like that it would be quite important to build up that writers community when becoming a writer or thinking about getting more into the hobby, as a lot of authors say. Would you say that would be accurate?
I think so, but I also think that it's important for every author to kind of do it in their own way. There's the
Mm,
ones that are going to dive headfirst into it, and they're going to want to grab
yeah.
every single person they can. As strange as it is, I think a very good place for me to kind of illustrate that is Twitter,
Yeah.
because Twitter was the first thing that I really jumped on as far as social media as a writer, as Marc Watson, the writing presence.
Mm,
And it's fairly well documented at this point that Twitter can be somewhat of a toxic place if you go into the right channels of it. If you curate it just right and you speak to the right people and you keep the right circle, you
mm,
can really grow that education and the contacts that you have in the space like that. And it's not just Twitter, it can be anything. It can be Facebook, it can be Instagram,
yeah.
it could be Pinterest. I know lots of people who have a great success on Pinterest. And that is really important. So it is really good to get those collections of people, but you also have to understand that, especially these days, there are a lot of them. So if you start having a
Mm,
conversation with somebody who, I'm not going to say flies in the face of what you think, because that's a good thing, but probably isn't someone that you feel is going to be a benefit to your writing journey, it's
mm,
okay to be like, yeah, thank you very much for your opinion. We're good. And speak to somebody else, because there are so many out there. It, in one way in the world today, we are creating, like talk about our social bubbles and how we start talking into an echo chamber, which is
mm,
one thing when it comes to societal issues and politics. But when it comes to writing, that's not a bad thing. You can listen to what other people's opinions are, but
mm.
very rarely, like, no two writers' journeys are the same. It's good to listen to everybody's and work with the ones who really complement you.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. That was a really awesome answer.
Thank you.
For an off the cuff question. That was fantastic. Thank you. I was just the other day when I was planning this interview with you, I saw that you mentioned on your website you've entered into flash fiction. What does flash fiction mean to those who aren't entirely sure what that means?
Yeah, flash fiction was my first real foray into a few different writing worlds. I found a website called 101 Words, and this is going back into 2016 again when I first got started in this. And 101words.org is the website, and it is a great place for young writers or writers who just want to kind of hone their craft a little bit, because they only publish word 101 word stories, no
Mm,
more, no less, right?
okay.
So you can create a story for them, and if they like what you have to offer and they're going to publish it on their website, they will assign you an editor, and then you get to work with an editor. And that was the first experience that I had working with an
Wow.
editor as well. And going back and forth and learning some of the terminology was just a huge thing, especially for somebody who was what I like to playfully refer to as an uneducated writer, which is exactly what I am. And that was very, very handy, because when you do flash fiction, so flash fiction is 5 words, 10 words, some kind of really small limit.
Mm.
I've mentioned before that I've done some fun stuff on Reddit on 2 sentence horror, which is one of the subreddits on there. And it's 2 sentences. And it's all about making sure that the words that you choose are as punchy and as impactful and as important as the next one.
Mm.
And it's a great way to, I'm a very wordy person, and especially when I write, and it's a great way to condense that and
Mm.
to try and try and milk and wring everything you can out of every single word. So flash fiction and the flash fiction community, that's just one website that I mentioned that I've worked with 3 or 4 times now. And there's other ones that are out there that do very similar premises. And
Mm.
it's it's easy, it's not time consuming, and most writers I know have a little notebook or have a folder on their desktop that has something that matches
Yeah.
the description of it, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just the nature of who we are
Yeah.
as artists. So yeah, that's flash fiction. It's a great world to get involved in.
I guess it would be really good practice as well for you to be able to hone how quickly you might be able to draft something up and then kind of revisit it later and see if you can develop more from it. Or I mean, I've never done flash fiction myself, so that would just be something that I've gleaned from what you've just said.
No, it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true. I when I need to sit down and write something, I've been very lucky in the fact that I can usually do it pretty quickly if I want to.
Mm.
But sometimes it does drag, or sometimes it's good to go back and to write something, to go back and take another look at it
Mm.
objectively in the future. And those short little snippets or tiny little stories that I put together, that other writers put together, is a great place to do that too.
That's fantastic. And I can see that you've come up with quite a few stories, you've come up with a few books now as well. But with especially with better conversations, did you say?
Between
Between
conversations.
conversations. I don't think
Between
it
conversations.
sorry.
I don't
Between
I
conversations.
I don't do punchy titles at all, except Catching Hell is a little bit, but between conversations and Death Dresses Poorly are like, I'm used to saying them now, but they're
Yeah.
still like they're not Hollywood friendly. I'll say that much.
Well, no, I was just wondering, like, how do you come up with the ideas for all these short stories and all the books that you've written so far?
The short story collection itself is very unique because what had happened is I wanted to release a short story in an anthology collection being put together by
Yeah.
IFWA, the group that I'm a part of. Every year for that When Words Collide convention, they put together a collection of stories with some of their members, and I was really in with them at the time. Like I really wanted to get involved with them, and so I submitted to them 2 stories, and one of them takes place in this Ryujin world, but it had nothing to do with any characters or even a timeline that I had dealt in before. It was completely related yet unrelated. And then
Mm.
I released another one, which was just a pure science fiction story that I was very proud of, and that was the one that they ended up publishing. So I was thankful that for that. But I had this other really great story just a short story, and it intrigued me because Catching Hell as a total is about 250,000 words, right, between part one and
Mm.
part two, and it's very sprawling. And the world that I had crafted that in, it really does. It takes place from roughly about the year 1600 and goes thousands of years into the future. That's
Mm.
kind of the world building that I had created,
Mm.
and I wanted to tell the stories of people who live in this world of science fiction and fantasy, but they're normal people like you and me, and at least some of them are. And just like, okay, it's all well and good for these globe spanning wars to be fought, but how does that
Mm.
affect this bartender that we only saw briefly in Catching Hell? Or how
Mm.
does that affect different, like there's all these little things that we never think about when we talk about large spanning epic fantasy. You never think about those side characters, but there's interesting things going on in their lives. And that
Yeah.
started between conversations. So the story itself
Mm.
is 9 short stories put together that each focus on different genres and different characters. Some we've visited before,
Mm.
some are brand new, and some we'll likely never see again. And it takes place chronologically. So it starts in the year 1600 and ends up going
That's cool.
thousands of years in the future. So that was the drive behind that. Catching Hell, I kind of said, like, it was a world that I've lived in mentally for a long time, like since I was a teenager. So I wanted to write that down. And as I said, it took about 5 years for me to do it. And then Death Dresses Poorly, which was my debut novel, due to the strange happenstance of release windows and how those work, because I had Catching Hell picked up for publication first from one publisher, and Death Dresses Poorly was picked up second, but that second publisher's release window was shorter, so it ended up coming out first, even
Oh,
though,
that's interesting.
yeah, I had a really busy 2017. It's 2017, 2018. So for that was my brain wipe. I had worked so hard, so long on Catching Hell and creating that world. Death Dresses Poorly was me going in a totally different direction, in an urban fantasy dark comedy, and something a lot shorter. It's only about 46,000 words or so, so a weekend read, as I call it. And I did it in 6 weeks. Between the writing,
Wow.
I did one round of editing, and then I was like, this is good. This is exactly where I want it to be. And I went out and I found the right publisher for it.
That's
And I've
fantastic.
thankfully worked with that publisher ever since. So yeah, it was like, I was so tired of living in the Catching Hell world. As much as I love it, as much as I love that story and those characters, I had to pivot a little bit and be all like, you know what? I'm going to do something ridiculous. I'm going to do something with heavy dialogue, which I didn't work on really, and comedy, which I'd never really written before, and just endless swearing, just swearing,
It
and
was brilliant.
so it was my brain squeegee. It was my way to stop and reset, and that's where that came from.
Yeah. So the book that I was gonna we were gonna go more in depth about today was Death Dresses Poorly. I can see. Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say dress, just like I don't know what a dress is,
What is
but
that?
I can see you're wearing your Death Dresses Poorly book cover T-shirt. That's very cool.
I am. I had this one made for a convention a few years ago. I had a shirt made for each of the covers of the books that I had back then, which is actually, Catching Hell was taken off of availability last year because the publisher, they didn't go under, but they sold their imprint to someone else, and I didn't want to necessarily follow with that. The new imprint wasn't someone that I related to and connected with as much. But the publisher of Death Dresses Poorly ended up picking it up, and so they're going to re-release it this year, which is going to be my next release. And so now I don't have those covers anymore. So my other shirts are just kind of like there, but this one's still good. And this is the one that Fluky Fiction out of Maine in the United States, they designed it, and I love the colors. I love the colors of the new Catching Hell Part 1 as well. It pops a lot, and they're really good at finding something that stands out on your bookshelf. And I was like, this is a perfect shirt for that. So
that is very cool. And I think that, you know, the binary on the front cover and the wackiness of it really kind of emphasizes the craziness that Ethan felt in the book. So I thought that was really quite interesting, that it reflects so well. Like, you look at the cover and you're like, how does this link? And then, like, actually while you're reading it, yeah, that's quite cool.
it does. I was never sure at first. Covers are never like, every one of my covers had kind of a different story, and how it came about. And this is the only one so far that I have had zero input in whatsoever, other than that there was one minor change. Originally, there was a different image inside. If you take a look at inside the television here, there was a different image. I was like, I don't feel that. And then they showed me this one. I'm like, boom, perfect. There you go.
That's the one. That's
Out
the
the door.
one.
So yeah, I'm very, very thankful that I found the publisher that I did. They get me. They understand me, and I didn't have to do very much with this. I saw it, and I'm like,
that's what you want.
Love it. Yeah.
To be able to get someone who knows what you want without you telling them. Mind reading, it does exist.
That is what I want. But I thought that was one of the reasons I wanted the publisher that I did. I targeted certain kinds of publishers, and again with Death Dresses Poorly, I was incredibly fortunate because I had looked up the publishers that were in the kind of genres that I was looking at. I was looking for a smaller publisher for sure, because I knew that it was a very niche title, and that I wasn't going to go to one of the big houses with it. And I applied to one publisher who knows, in another world might have been okay, but they're like, it's great, but it's not really us. And then
Mm,
at about that same time, I applied to the one who picked up this one, and they picked it up right away. So it was on my
mm,
second attempt to get it done. So everything with Death Dresses Poorly has always rolled very quickly. I can say for all the authors out there who are like, that bastard. No, like I have been through the stack of rejection letters
mm.
tale as well when I was trying to get Catching Hell made, because that
Crikey.
was far more daunting. But I was incredibly
Yeah.
fortunate with this one, and I'm lucky to have them.
Yeah, that's all. I think that's every writer's fear, is going through the query letters and then going through rejection letters. And you put so much effort into a query letter to getting it just right, and then boom, it comes back, and they've probably skim read it really quickly, thought, I like this letter,
Exactly.
but it's not for us, or whatever the reason is. But I can imagine that that's a not. I've never gone through the process personally. I'm slightly too scared to. But
It's it is somewhat scary. What I will say is I appreciate a good rejection letter.
mm,
I am not going to put myself out there for the sole purpose of being praised for everything that I've done.
yeah.
I want honest criticism and feedback. And one thing I learned very quickly and very early on in this journey is a response of any kind is
Mm,
actually a little bit of an outlier. Most of the time you send the query letter and they say, if we are interested, we may get back to you
yeah.
in 3 months. And you're like, well, and then you never hear from them again. And
Yeah.
I do the proper thing, as every young writer should do, whereas you follow up and just, hey, have you guys had a chance to take a look at it?
Mm,
It's much like sending out a CV to somebody, and just like
yeah.
being like, hey, don't forget about me. I'm still interested.
Yeah.
And it's a daunting process, but again, like I said, I appreciate the rejection letters, because most of the time, as far as I can see, they weren't done by a machine. It's not just
Mm,
like it is. We really like this, but we don't necessarily think this part of it is for us, and this is the reason why we're saying no. Which means, okay, somebody took a look at it, and that's good, and that could always turn into opportunities later on down the road.
that's fantastic. Well, my next question was, your books, Death Dresses Poorly and Between Conversations, are very different compared to each other.
Mhm.
What made you write about urban fantasy slash science fiction to the collection of short stories?
I can say that genre fiction has always been where I've been the most comfortable writing.
Mm,
So science fiction, fantasy, or in this world, it's very much science fantasy. It is a world where magic and technology comes together.
mm,
So I've always liked writing in that world. That's why my first major release that I worked on anyway, again, Death Dresses.
yeah.
Uh, but that's why that kind of fell into that genre. I was very much influenced by the things that I was consuming at the time in the 1990s when it comes to popular culture, and it was mostly things in that genre. And Death Dresses Poorly, like I said, I had to pivot
Mm,
180 degrees and go a completely different direction just to kind of reset myself. And that one I took from a lot of, like, Neil Gaiman was a huge influence
mm,
on that one. Just he seems to write in that same kind of niche genre for a lot of things, right? Like
mm,
it's urban fantasy, maybe not necessarily dark comedy, but he does have a lot of great comedy. Like Good Omens is a fantastic comedy, like it is a dark comedy story,
yeah.
and so that was a big influence as well. And I've also said Douglas Adams was a big one, because
Mm,
he's he writes quirky, he writes strange, he writes, like, if you take a look at the Hitchhiker series, it's a fantasy. It really is
yeah.
a fantasy. It's a science fiction, but it is absolutely it is
Mm,
absolutely follows all the fantasy tropes for sure.
definitely.
So I like to say that it's like Douglas Adams, but with a lot more swearing. And I have to keep coming back to that, because I've had people pick it up and they're like, it's a little too much rich language for me. And I'm like, I warn people ahead of time. I think I did the math on it one time, and it ended up being something like 0.7% of the words in Death
Yeah.
Dresses Poorly are some form of naughty, haughty language. So it's something I got to put out there. But yeah, the the first chapter is something that happened to me, and I freely admit it. It's pulling from what we know, and the location. and the conversation that kind of happens because between the two main characters, because Death Dresses Poorly is really about two main characters. There's
Mm.
Ethan and the Man in Black, and
Mm.
it's it was like some of the framing around it, like in the book I spoil nothing by saying that Ethan is coming, he's in an airport and he's coming back from his mother's funeral after she died of an overdose.
Mm.
She was a drug abuser and very emotionally manipulative of him and emotionally abusive. So
Mm.
that's where he's coming from. He's only recently kind of broken out of this. He finally
Mm.
abandoned her, and so none of that is true. Absolutely none of it. That part of it did not happen. My
Yeah.
mother's alive and I love her to death. But that's where that came from. That was very much inspired by a real world event that was
Yeah.
just so strange. I could never let it go. My creative mind held
Mm.
onto it for years.
And yet I've worked in the past with a lot of people who have addictions, and yet it was so real. It was so real from my professional standpoint. And I was like, you've either done your research or have experienced this in some way. So it's fantastic reading it because it was just so accurate.
And, and I'm happy to hear that
Yeah.
because it was a lot of research, which
Mm.
was strange for me because, again, writing genre fiction, I don't have to do research. I get to blow up the world, and then reality is whatever I make it.
Yep.
And apocalypses are great for creativity. But when you're writing something that is more grounded, like Death
Mm.
Dresses Poorly is, there is a responsibility that you have to take if you don't necessarily come from that world or are completely familiar with it, where
Mm.
you have to treat it properly because somebody is going to pick it up. And I'm happy to hear you say that it comes across that way because it's not
Mm.
necessarily something that I've dealt with personally, but I do think that there's a lot of things that have happened in my life that I can equate to that kind of thing. And then when it comes to behavioral patterns and the cycle of the addicts and those kinds of things, that's the kind of stuff that I had to
Yeah.
research for it.
Yeah. No, that was really, really cool because it really did come through. And I appreciated that because I was just like, this is absolutely fantastic. And yet it was dark satire, and it drew me in more. And being British and sarcastic, eternally sarcastic,
Yes,
I
yes.
appreciated that as well.
Sarcasm is fantastic. Sarcasm is my natural defense. And
Yeah.
when I was writing the characters, I I feel as though the sarcasm came naturally because they would just be saying things that I would have said in that exact same scenario. Like I was just writing what I'm thinking at the time.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that much of a stretch. That's why I was able to get through it so quickly. I'm like, this is easy.
Yeah.
This is me. I don't have to inhabit a ancient, powerful Scottish phoenix man,
Mm.
which is one of the main characters in Catching Hell. I have no point of reference for that, but
Yeah.
I have a point of reference for being a sarcastic jerk. I can tell you that much.
So is Ethan a little reflective of you, or is Death a little reflective of you as well in parts?
They both are. They both
Yeah.
are because I like to say that it's 20-year-old Mark meets like 50, 55-year-old Mark. And
Yeah.
the kind, like, they're very similar but very different. And I think this goes to just about anybody. If you were to
Mm.
take your 20-year-old self and put it against your 50-year-old self, whether you're there or not at either one of those, you're going to have conflict. There's going to be that clash of
Mm.
similar yet different personalities.
Yeah.
There's the more weathered one, and then there's the one that's ready to go out and take on the world. And
Mm.
I firmly believe that 20-year-old us and 50-year-old us would not be friends. They might see in each other similarities, but they would not get along very well. And
No,
that's very much kind of the premise behind this.
that's quite interesting. So, how did you come up with the concept of death and Ethan's journey in Death Dresses Poorly?
Well, it was a lot of the influences again because I had written it that much later in life. I was no longer pulling from like the anime that I was watching in the 90s, right? Like it
Yeah.
doesn't really jive with that anymore. It was very much a lot of the books that I was reading and the things that I was watching, and there was a lot of Neil Gaiman at that time, I admit. And it was the journey came very naturally. I am not a plotter at all when it
Mm.
comes to writing. I am pure pantser, And so I knew where I wanted to get started with that strange scenario, that strange meeting with a man in black
Yeah.
in Chicago's O'Hare Airport, and this weird conversation about fast food and deaf mute beggars, which
Yeah.
will all make sense if you pick up the book and give it a listen or give it a read. And I knew where I wanted it to end, and the in between, I knew the style. I knew I wanted to go with that kind of
Mm,
Gaiman-esque, very believable, grounded, yet also fantastical. And
mm,
then I just started writing and finding out where that was going to go. And
mm.
Death Dresses Poorly is the end result. It is me just going blah on a keyboard for about 4 weeks or so, and then dialing it back a little bit and fixing things in the editing process for a week or two after
That's
that.
fantastic. I love that description of it, the blur.
It really is, everything with Catching Hell, because I knew that it was growing this Ryujin world that I really do want to tell a long list of stories in. It had to be far more meticulous. I had to go back and edit
Mm,
and make sure that I was catching things that could trip me up in the future, because should I ever take off in any way, build up any kind of fandom, someone's going to be all like, well, you see on page 100 in this book you contradict what happens in page 75, and like, it's going to happen. And
yeah.
I wanted to avoid that because I'm one of those people. And with Death Dresses Poorly, which I just wanted to be a one-off brain wiping story, it was very much just like blah. Let's see what happens. And
That's
there you go.
brilliant. That's fantastic. So when you created the environment for, let's say, DDP, because for some reason I keep saying dress before I say it. I
DDP is what I stick with. Yeah,
can't.
my own fault. I named it, and nobody
Well,
stopped me.
no, it's a perfectly good title, but for some reason my brain doesn't seem to want to let my mouth know what the actual words are. It's just me being a bit weird. So when you imagined the environment of DDP, how did you make it so consistent? While I was listening to it, it felt really vivid.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear that. I like to think that part of that is the writing and part of that is the narrator. Mm. And I I consciously wanted to create something that was almost claustrophobic.
Okay.
The story moves scene to scene to
Mm,
scene, as most good stories do, but there are very few of those that are not in some kind of closed-in space.
yeah.
It takes place in a small section of an airport, or it takes place in a diner, or like
Mm,
there's things going on around the outside, but for the most part, it's very, very closed. So without giving too much away, when things do kind of expand a little bit and things get a little bit bigger, they become that much more fantastical,
mm,
because suddenly these characters are in places that have no walls,
mm,
and the the walls are so far away you cannot see them. So they are free to kind of mentally roam these spaces, and then you get come back into something tight again. And I think
yeah.
that goes a long way in creating those vivid spaces, as you say, because
Mm,
I don't have to suddenly create this massive world. I have to create the feeling inside
yeah.
a bedroom or inside a diner or one of these other
Mm,
small spaces, which is much easier to create a vivid picture of
yeah.
than explaining something like I do in Catching Hell, where the characters are traversing these vast landscapes and strange locales.
That sounds really interesting. I'll have to read the other book. What was the name of it? The one that you've just mentioned? Sorry.
Catching Hell
Catching
Part
Hell.
1 and Catching Hell Part 2. Part 1, Journey, as I said, it was out, but
Hmm.
it's going to be coming back. So there's actually pre-order links already available on Amazon for the re-release on May 25th. So it's going to be coming up pretty
Fantastic.
quick here. So,
Yeah.
and if nothing else, go take a look at it just for the cover, because
Yeah.
again, they've hit it out of the park with the cover. This one I had more feedback in. If
Hmm.
anybody ever saw the cover of the first version of Catching Hell, there is clearly some mirror similarities. There was something very specific that I wanted, but they found it and they perfected it, and the color and the fonts and everything. I love it.
That's fantastic. Um, so my next question was, would you say that, I know you've mentioned Neil Gaiman, but would you say that there are other writers who have influenced your writing style?
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, I think there's a lot of them. It's just since we're talking about Death Dresses Poorly, it wears its Damon influence on its sleeve,
Yeah.
and I lean into that a little bit. For the most part, a lot of my writing has been influenced by people like Terry Brooks, who did the Shannara series,
Okay.
which was something that I never got into. I was never into fantasy very much at all when I was younger. When it comes to reading, I was
Mm.
more science fiction. And years later, he released a series called the Word and Void series. So by this point, he'd already created so much of the Shannara world. I'm like, I knew Terry Brooks existed. I knew Shannara
Yeah.
existed. I wanted to get into his reading, but I didn't want to start reading. Well, like if I read Sword of Shannara, then I got to read these 12 other books that he's like. That's just the way that my brain works.
Yeah.
So he's like, yeah, no, I'm going to release this new series. It's called Word and Void. It's an urban fantasy. Check it out. So I did. It was great. I love the way that he structured the story. It was very accessible. And then
Mm.
afterwards, he came out and said, oh, by the way, this is actually the prequel to all of Shannara, like the whole thing. Like this is where everything begins. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, fine. Okay, because I really liked it, and
Yeah.
that's what a good marketing writer will do. It's just like, oh yeah, no, I did something new. It's not really new. It's actually related to this, and now you're going to go read 13 books. I'm like, oh my god. And I did, and I read every single one. So the thing about Brooks that I really appreciate is I'm not going to sit here and tell you that he's my favorite author. There's a lot of
Mm.
things that I can personally critique about him, whether it's as a writer or as a reader. But he does it perfectly when it comes to telling the story he wants to tell. And
Yeah.
most of the time, especially after that initial Sword and Elf Stones and Wish Song trilogy,
Mm.
he's telling the same story, but he's doing it in a newer and creative way, and he
Yeah.
adds little flakes of new elements to it. So there's nothing wrong with telling the same story. Now he's done it literally 24 times, and I've read them all, and I
Yeah.
haven't been disappointed. So I think that that's something that as writers we can really kind of learn to emulate. Like you
Yeah.
can write that same story over and over. It's okay.
Yeah.
Um, Also, Stephen King, clearly, I mean, he
Yeah.
influences us all. There's a lot of things that he says and does that I don't agree with at all.
His views can be quite controversial at times.
They can be. They can be. He's very rigid in the way that he wants to have books written, and
Mm.
he's the most successful author of all time, so he is allowed to do that. I'm not saying he's not. But when he steps out of his safe zone, and
Mm.
he created the Dark Tower series, and that was also a huge influence because it is
Mm.
just fantasy. It is retelling Tolkien in some way,
Mm.
shape, or form, and Tolkien's influences can be seen through all genres of fantasy now. It's such a different thing, especially like at the time. Like it's fairly well documented that the 70s and 80s were a pretty crazy time for Stephen King, for a lot of different reasons. But
Mm.
to still create a world that vivid and so interesting, and the characters
Definitely.
and the journey that they go on is undeniably an accomplishment that cannot be ignored,
Mm.
especially when compared against, well, here's all of his other more easily consumable, easily made into movies and TV shows
Yeah.
books, right? Like it is not one of those. It's never going to be one of those. And that was huge for me to read those and be all like, hey, if the guy who wrote like Cujo and Salem's Lot can make something like Wizard and Glass, which is one of my favorite books of all time,
Mm.
then I'm going about this writing thing all wrong. And now I've done it in different genres as well.
That's fantastic and really very inspirational. Um, I wanted to ask, which may be quite a sensitive subject, maybe, if you had to pin it down, which book that you've written is your favorite and why?
It's always a sensitive subject. I'm not going to say it's like picking children because it's really not. Every book has a different story.
Yeah.
But I think if I think about the effort that has gone into it, I can't deny that Catching Hell is a like it ended up being exactly what I wanted it to be,
Yeah.
and it took a lot of work to do that. And I'm so thankful that it comes and it goes, and I could seriously write a book just on the
Mm.
journey of that book in
Mm.
particular because it's been such a crazy one. But in the end, I always come back to Death Dresses Poorly. When I had my first book done and printed and in my hands, it was Death
Mm.
Dresses Poorly, and I don't know where it came from. I don't know. I don't know why I even wrote it other than to clear my brain. And when the time came to do an audiobook, Death Dresses Poorly, and re-inhabiting that world again. And
Yeah.
I was it always seems to come back to that. It's the one that has absolutely had the most success for me, so I can say that much. And now that the audiobook is out and is doing quite well again, I I, I think I have to say Death Dresses Poorly, just because Catching Hell is always going to be incredibly personal for me, because that is 15-year-old Mark still sitting there, still writing by hand in his
Yeah.
book, only now he's doing it on a laptop. But Death Dresses Poorly this is Mark the author with something to put out into the world
Something to
that maybe you
say.
haven't seen before. You've
Yeah.
seen Catching Hell before in some way. I lean into the tropes, and I admit that. I just hope that I do my own thing with them. But Death Dresses Poorly was always something else. So I'm going to say that for now.
That's fantastic. I mean, there's nothing wrong with leaning into tropes. A lot of people say, "Oh, I don't want to read a book that's got an obvious trope or a trope," and I'm like, well, all books have a trope, because
They
otherwise you'd
do.
be bored.
They do. I get that a lot too, and especially when I'm talking about writing fantasy and how I like to lean into them, because they're tropes for a reason.
Yeah.
We, especially the casual reader, likes those points.
Yeah.
They like good versus bad, and they like swords and sorcery, and they like
Yeah.
dragons for fantasy, and it's just it's okay
Yeah.
to have them. You don't want to completely ape what has been coming before you. You can put your own spin on it, but don't be afraid to use them, because they're there for a reason.
Definitely, definitely. So what would be the main bit of advice that you would give a budding writer?
Ah, my favorite question. And the the most distinct, clear answer to that I can give you is, do not set goals.
Okay.
And that it's a very broad statement, but do not set goals. Ever since I started coming into this as a writer who's going out and talking to other writers,
Mm.
I've found that, although not necessarily what I would call controversial, it is not a popular opinion, because young writers, especially, they see people talking about writing targets and things that you have
Yeah.
to do in order to be a successful writer.
Mm.
Again, something else that Stephen King has said, like how many words it takes for you to be a writer. I think he says 1 million words written in order to be a writer. And that's not necessarily true for me. And whether it's somebody saying, I've got to write 5 words a day, or and I'm going to touch on it because I hate it so much, and that is NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, which falls every November, where you have the goal of trying to create a novel in that time. Now,
Mm.
I'm going to say this as
Mm.
a hypocrite, a total hypocrite, because Death Dresses Poorly and Between Conversations were both written in November.
Okay.
Had nothing to do with
Nothing with Rimo.
NaNoWriMo, nothing for NaNoWriMo, but they were both written, and
Yeah.
so I've technically won it twice, even though I wasn't even trying. It's just I do really good writing in November. It's one of my favorite
Yeah.
times of the year, and I feel really inspired by the cold, harsh environment starting to crush me here in central Canada. And when I'm talking about goals, and I'm talking to people about it, I'm saying, if you write 5 words, write five
Mm.
words. If you
That's
write
yeah.
5,000, write 5,000.
Yeah.
Don't set a goal. Don't set a goal when it comes to how much you want to read in order to become, because I read so little. I'm a busy
Yeah.
guy with other things going on in his life. I can't read that much.
Mm.
I read maybe 2 books, 3 books a year if I'm lucky.
Mm.
And things like NaNoWriMo, where you set these goals on yourself, if you don't reach them, there's always this inherent bitterness that you kind of
Mm.
feel, for a lot of people, not everybody, but a
Yeah.
lot of people, like, I made it to 37,000 words. Like, that is a fantastic
That's a huge
accomplishment,
amount. Yeah.
but it feels but it feels empty for some people, because they didn't reach 40, 45, 50, whatever it was that their goal was.
Yeah.
In this pandemic year that we've kind of experienced right now, I've spoken to a lot of writers who are like, this is the most prolific I've been in I don't know how long, because I'm locked in
Yeah.
my house with nothing else to do. And up until a little while ago, I had written maybe 5,000 words. And
Mm.
that 5,000 words wasn't great. I wasn't happy with it. And I was like, it was for another kind of genre story that I'm working on. And I'm like, nope, still, no, not there. It's changed a little bit lately, but
Mm.
I'm okay with the fact that I've only written a small amount because there's
Yeah.
so many other things in the world going on right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone should ever behold themselves to a solid
Absolutely.
number that this is what I need to do.
It is a lot of pressure. It is. And
It
I
is.
think the good thing about NaNoWriMo, I utilized it last year and I wrote 20,000 words. And I thought to myself, if I don't meet that goal, I'm not going to beat myself up about it. I'm not going to allow that, because I know that's so easy a trap to fall into. Um, but it's not just about writing a book in a month. It's about getting your ideas onto paper and doing as much as you're able to, and as much as you can, because like you say, life happens, things
It
come in,
does.
get in the way.
It does. I can't speak for every author because every author's journey is different, just like I said.
Mm.
But forced words are usually not our best words, is
And
what I
yeah,
have found.
yeah.
And maybe it just means that we have to go back and edit things or change things farther down the road. But
Mm.
when I've let things flow freely, I have had a
Mm.
far better writing experience than any time I've ever tried to force it, to the point
Mm.
where I have just simply stopped trying to force it.
Yeah.
I write when I want to write, I write how much I want to write, and if it means I only release one book every couple of years, if that, then so be it. This is not my full-time job. I don't want it to be my full-time job. I really like my
Mm.
full-time job, but it is a hobby that I treat seriously, so I want to make sure I do it right and I'm respectful to it. But maybe I don't release anything, and that's okay because I wasn't in a place where I could mentally write. And if everything was to come crashing down and I never felt like writing again, I
Mm.
wouldn't feel as though I got cheated at all. I think I've had incredible success that I'm very thankful for, and it was a great story to tell.
That's fantastic. Do what you can, do what you're able to do. Don't force it. That is really important advice, because I think Stephen King gave out the advice that every writer needs to read. And while
Yes.
I don't disagree, I think, yeah, but you shouldn't judge people on how much you read, right? Because I'm sure
No,
he reads a lot. I don't know.
I'm sure he probably does. And that's one of the key things that he has said that I'm like,
Yeah.
no. Like, I just outright disagree with you, world's most prolific and successful author. But but he comes at it from a very unique perspective, and I've read his works on how to write, like on writing is a great example. And uh, I get where he's coming from, where he
Mm,
is in his life. I completely understand. But to pigeonhole us all into
yeah.
that, that's very dangerous.
Yeah, which is it's interesting, because that's where audiobooks can be utilized better, I think. And I was going to ask you a question after this next question about that,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
for sure.
which is what's next for you?
Oh, I have no idea. There's always so much. Lunch is next for me.
Lunch. Oh,
I I always have a lot kind of going on. As I said, I released my first self-published book
mm,
last September. That came out in between conversations, and then I decided to do the audiobook for Death Dresses Poorly, which I'm be happy to touch on. But the next thing coming out is, as I mentioned, is the reworked, remastered, brand spanking new
yeah.
coat of paint, Catching Hell Part 1 Journey, released by Fluky Fiction, which will be on May 25th. We're going through the final editing process of that right now.
Okay.
Anybody who ever picked up the first version of it will know that it was pretty rough. I was in a different place and I was working with a different team at the time, and
Mm,
I'm proud of the story, but I'm not necessarily happy with how it came out. And I just chalk it up to a writer's experience that I had never had before. And I said that I'd only written about 5,000 words. That was on a story that one day I'll finish, maybe. I'm like two-thirds done, but I just don't feel like I can write the ending. So I just keep putting it off. But I have been very inspired lately because I went back to listening to music again, which was something that I kind of stopped doing for a while, but
mm,
my work isn't as busy as it used to be. So I can listen to some music while I'm working sometimes, or at
mm,
lunch, or while I'm walking the dog. And that got me writing in the Ryujin world again, to a proper sequel to Catching Hell, not just
mm.
the between conversations kind of small display takes place in the same world. Same characters, well, at least the ones that I can, and I've done pretty good getting into that. So I haven't written epic science fan, like an epic story,
Mm,
since like I haven't touched one for like 10 years when I was writing Catching Hell years ago.
mm,
So it's interesting coming at it from a new perspective, as somebody who's been in the writing world now, and
That's
I
brilliant.
remember what I went through. I don't want to go through 5 years of getting something like that out again, but I
Yeah.
don't think that's going to be a risk. But yeah, that's I'm writing that, and I'm thinking about my next audiobook as well. I think I'd really like to do between conversations as an audiobook at some point, and I'm
Yeah.
also putting myself out there for other people's audiobooks. If you like what it is that I have to offer, I'm glad to talk to you about putting your words out there into the world myself in my humble little setup.
That's brilliant, and that's what I wanted to ask you about. Was when I got the book, it was the audio book copy, and you narrated it yourself, which, from my experience, I've not come across very often. Authors narrating their own stories, but it felt like, using your voice, you knew the message that you wanted to give out about this book, and I think it really, you used the narration really well to make that point. Um, and I think the thing was how did that come about? And tell us more about how to do that, because I'm sure there are lots of authors out there who are like, oh, I might want to get into that.
It's true, and that's kind of where I was. We're in pandemic world right now, so a lot of us are trying to find, if not side hustles, just something else to do. We're trying to discover
Yeah.
new hobbies. Like we've all been through the baking sourdough moments in our lives during this pandemic,
Mm.
and I didn't. My wife did, and nailed it, by the way. And there were things that I've been working on that have nothing to do with writing, just being creative and keeping my hands busy. And I was talking to someone and they're like, this would make a really good audiobook. And it's like,
Mm.
I keep hearing that. And I started looking around at narrators for audiobooks and like looking for freelance people on Fiverr and those kinds of places.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm looking and I'm watching some videos on YouTube. I'm like, it's not that hard. Like it's like I'm not going to
Right.
short sell it and say that it's so easy and everyone can do it. I'm not going to say that, especially if you want to do it right or you make it as a career. You're way better at it than I am. But with the right amount of time and attention and detail, and just with a small investment, I was able to learn how to do it. There's great free audio editing software out there in the world.
Mm.
It's very comprehensive, and there's great plugins that you can get to it that make it meet the Audible and the what's called the ACX standard. ACX is
Mm.
Amazon's branch that looks after whatever goes on to Audible,
Yeah.
which is also Amazon because everything is Amazon. And I invested in a microphone and pop filters, and I'll be the first to admit that I did it all in a closet. I just soundproofed my walk-in closet in my master bedroom, and I just went in there for a little bits at a time, reading a chapter or two at a time, and then just kind of felt my way through the process. I went to a bunch of websites to educate myself on how to do it. As I said, I watched videos on YouTube that have been incredibly helpful.
Mm.
And I ended up going back to Fluky Fiction and saying, I really want to do this, and I've started. Do you, do you mind? Like, because we're in this together, and I really want you guys to be a part of this as well to make
Okay.
sure that this gets released under your banner. And they're like, absolutely, you do your thing, you send it to us, we'll check, double check it, and we'll release it together, and we'll keep working together. And that was exactly what I needed to hear. And then yeah, I just recorded it. I am very fortunate to in my circle of friends there actually happens to be a voice actor or two who are able to just give me like little tips about drink this, don't drink that, and things like that when I'm in
Yeah.
recording for an hour or two, and that was invaluable. And yeah, we put it together, and it was released just about a month ago now, and it was a ton of fun. And as you said,
Mm.
these characters on one side, I couldn't really afford to have somebody read it for me, but on the other
Mm.
hand, I felt like if there's any of my stories that needs my voice specifically, this is the one,
That's the
because
one.
these characters are absolutely versions of myself.
Mm.
And I wanted to make sure that the inflection in my voice hit the right parts of the punchlines, and the sarcastic tone was reached properly, and the
Yeah.
emotional moments had the right amount of punch.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I I feel like I am man enough to admit there is times, and man and vain enough to admit I'm almost making myself cry in my closet as I'm trying to tell
Yeah.
some of these really emotional hitting moments in this story, because it just hits me so hard. Even if
Yeah.
uh, I've never been through it, they are characters very much like myself, reacting how I would react. So there is a
Mm,
personal element to it. So
wow.
hopefully that comes through, and somebody who listens to it enjoys it and understands what it was that I was trying to do. And if I get
Yeah.
the opportunity to do between conversations, it'll be totally different, because then I can mess with accents, and I can play with different roles and characters and people, which is great. I've wanted to bust out my stereotypical Scottish accent for so long in a recorded way. My great grandfather would be like, ah, terrible. And I'd be like, nah, whatever. This is,
I'm gonna do it anyway.
I'm going to do it anyway.
No, that's fantastic. My partner is Scottish on his side, and my grandmother's Scottish on her side as well. So, yeah, I can't do a Scottish accent for the life of me. So, well done. It's a hard one to do.
It is absolutely a hard one to do. I found that as I've practiced it, it's kind of built into my tongue a little bit.
Yeah,
Like I am very much a Canadian, by which I mean my great grandfather came over from Edinburgh when he was about 12 years old as a home child.
yeah.
And that, in my lineage, that is the closest to not Canada that any of my family goes. I go back 8, 9 generations in some directions in Canada.
Wow.
So, but my parentage and my name, that's where it all comes from. So
Oh,
that's the one that
yeah.
I feel like I can do the closest. And like I said, when I was doing it, I'm just like, yeah, I can have a
This
lot of
feels
fun
right.
with this.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, I'll just watch a couple of like Gerard Butler interviews and just kind of pick up what I'm missing, and then I go from there.
I'll give you some advice. Billy Connolly, for a
Oh yeah,
very
that too.
broad, yeah,
Yes,
he's
absolutely,
amazing.
absolutely. And also, just like Billy Connolly in general, like even if you have no interest in doing Scottish acts, just go watch Billy
Just
Connolly, because
he's a
he's
legend.
absolutely brilliant. He's fantastic, and yeah, just an all-around amazing human being.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sitting here and nattering with me. It's been great to get to know you a little bit more. So to finish off this session today, Mark is going to talk about some books that he's got up for grabs. Take
Yeah,
it away.
absolutely. Because I've been talking about it so much, and I'm sitting here with the shirt on and whatnot, I would absolutely love to give away 2 copies of the physical version of Death Dresses Poorly to 2 people. I'll let you go through the details of how we're going to work that out, but I have 2 copies here that I am excited to be able to personalize and sign and throw some other swag in there with it, and send it off, because like I said, it's one of my favorite stories, and I really think that it's probably one of my most accessible ones. So if you're against haughty language, maybe not enter this one, but
Real.
it comes from an honest place, is what I'll tell you. It's not there
Yeah.
just for the sake of it, as I think anybody who's listened to it or has read it will tell you. And I would love nothing more than for 2 engaged listeners or watchers to grab a copy, and I am happy to send that to them.
Fantastic. So if you're over 16 and you're able to verify your own consent of giving out your address and things like that, then get in touch. Just comment in our Instagram and Twitter social media handles. Mark, what's your social media handles?
My social media handles are at Wright Watson on Instagram and Twitter. Twitter is where I'm the most active, so that's
Real.
WRITEWATSON. On Facebook at facebook.com/Mark Wrote a Book, all one word, MARC. And you can also just reach me at my website. I love it when people reach out to me on my website, because I know that they went there for a personal reason. Like I've directed them to, and they really wanted to check me out. And also, it's really nice getting comments that aren't spam on there. That's
Yeah.
because there's a lot. But you
Yeah.
can find me at markwatson.ca, MARCWATSON.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. So yes, peeps, I'm going to make a post on my social media as well, and I'll give you all the instructions and stuff, and I'll post it in the description in YouTube and everything. It'll be nice and clear, and we'll give everybody about 7 working days approximately. So probably Monday, a week following next week. That would be probably a good time to wrap it all up and then get everybody well, I'll do it out of the hat sort of scenario and randomly choose two people. That's
Excellent.
two people. But yeah, so thank you so much for joining us, peeps, and watching and listening right until the end. It's much appreciated. And we shall speak with you again soon. So thank you so much, Mark. And I
Thank
will
you very much.
end it there. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody, or evening or day, wherever you are in the world. You are appreciated. Thanks. Bye.